Traveling alone had always been my escape. It gave me time to think, to detach from the monotony of life, and to reconnect with myself. But after what happened last summer, I doubt I'll ever travel alone again. It started as a spontaneous decision. I was burned out from work and needed a break. Scrolling through travel blogs late one night, I stumbled upon a post about a remote mountain town. The pictures looked idyllic: winding roads, cozy cabins, and breathtaking views of misty peaks. Perfect for a weekend getaway. I booked a cabin through a small rental website. The owner, Claire, responded quickly, assuring me the cabin was quiet and secluded but close enough to the main road in case I needed anything. I loved the idea of isolation. A weekend without Wi-Fi or cell service sounded perfect. The next morning, I packed my car with essentials: snacks, a flashlight, a few books, and my camera. The drive would take 6 hours, and I couldn't wait to leave the city behind. The first few hours of the drive were peaceful. The interstate eventually gave way to rural highways, then winding mountain roads surrounded by dense forests. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool mountain air wash over me. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the scenery became eerily beautiful. The shadows of the trees stretched across the road, and the light turned golden, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. But as the hours passed, I began to notice something strange. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. No headlights behind me, no taillights ahead. It felt like I was the only person for miles. The sense of isolation, which I'd initially craved, began to feel suffocating. It was almost dark when I finally turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin. My GPS had stopped working an hour earlier, but Claire's directions were straightforward. "Drive down the gravel road for 2 miles, she'd written. "The cabin is the only one on the left." The road was narrow, barely wide enough for my car, and lined with trees so dense they blocked out what little light remained. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the cabin. It was small and rustic, just as Claire had described, with a wooden porch and a single light above the door. Relief washed over me as I parked the car and stepped out. The air was cold, and the forest was eerily silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence I'd been expecting. This was oppressive, heavy. I brushed the thought aside and grabbed my bags. Inside, the cabin was cozy but sparse. A small kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a single bedroom. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and no cell signal. Just me, the forest, and the quiet. Perfect. I spent the first evening reading by the fireplace, letting the crackling flames soothe my nerves. By the time I went to bed, I'd almost forgotten the unease I'd felt earlier. But that night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. I lay still, listening, my heart pounding in the darkness. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from outside. I told myself it was probably a tree branch brushing against the cabin. But as I sat up and strained to listen, I realized it was too deliberate for that. Someone, or something, was knocking on the window. I crept out of bed and moved toward the sound, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The tapping stopped as I reached the living room. For a moment, there was only silence. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw movement outside the window. A shadow. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow lingered for a moment, then disappeared into the darkness. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. I locked all the doors and windows and spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch, the fireplace blazing. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. Sleep deprivation and the isolation had probably made me jumpy. I decided to spend the day hiking, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear my head. The forest was beautiful during the day, its towering trees and winding trails a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the night before. I spent hours exploring, taking pictures of the moss-covered rocks and sun-dappled clearings. But as I hiked deeper into the woods, I started to feel like I was being watched. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, the sensation of unseen eyes following my every move. I stopped and turned around, scanning the trees. Nothing. I shook off the feeling and continued, but it only grew stronger. That's when I saw it. A figure standing between the trees. It was distant, barely more than a silhouette, but it was unmistakably human. "Hello!" I called, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. "Do you need help?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward. Still no response. A wave of fear crashed over me. I turned and hurried back down the trail, my heart pounding. When I glanced back over my shoulder, the figure was gone. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. I locked the door behind me, double-checking each lock. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had followed me. That night, I lit every lamp in the cabin, unwilling to let the darkness creep in. But the lights didn't keep the shadows away. Just after midnight, the knocking started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the window in the kitchen, then the living room, then the bedroom. I stood in the middle of the cabin, clutching a kitchen knife, my chest heaving with shallow breaths. "Who's there?" I shouted. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the noise. Then, from outside the cabin, I heard a voice. "Let me in." It was a man's voice, low and rough, barely more than a whisper. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my ears. "Go away!" I shouted. The voice didn't respond. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was still no signal. That's when the doorknob rattled. I ran to the bedroom and locked the door, barricading it with the dresser. My hands shook as I clutched the knife, listening to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Whoever was out there walked back and forth, their footsteps slow and deliberate. And then they stopped. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear. Minutes passed, then hours. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the window, I dared to leave the bedroom. The porch was empty, but the air outside felt wrong, too still, too heavy. I decided to leave that morning. I packed my bags in record time, threw them into the car, and started the engine. But when I tried to drive down the gravel road, I found it blocked. A tree had fallen across the road, its massive trunk too large to move. I had no choice but to turn back to the cabin. Panic clawed at my chest as I parked the car and ran inside. The knocking started again that night, and this time it didn't stop. I don't know how long I stayed in the cabin after that. Time became a blur, a cycle of fear and exhaustion. The figure outside never came inside, but it didn't have to. Its presence was enough to drive me to the edge of sanity. Every night, I heard it pacing on the porch, its voice whispering through the cracks in the walls. "Let me in." Every morning, I would find new scratches on the windows, new footprints in the dirt outside. I tried to leave again, but the road was still blocked, and I didn't dare venture into the woods on foot. I was trapped. On the fourth night, the knocking stopped. At first, I thought it was a relief, but the silence that followed was worse. And then, just before dawn, I heard a new sound. Breathing. It was coming from inside the cabin. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen and crept toward the sound, my pulse pounding in my ears. The bedroom door was open. Inside, I saw him, the man from the woods. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. I stepped closer, the knife trembling in my hand. "Who are you?" I whispered. He turned slowly, and I felt the blood drain from my face. His eyes were empty sockets, his skin pale and stretched tight over his skull. He smiled, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. "You let me in," he said. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke up, I was in my car, parked on the side of a highway miles from the cabin. The sunlight streamed through the windshield, harsh and bright. My body ached as if I'd been in a fight, and my head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I tried to make sense of where I was. The cabin, the man, the empty eyes. Had it been real? Or had I finally cracked under the weight of isolation and fear? Looking at the clock, I saw that it was mid-afternoon, but I couldn't recall how I'd gotten here. My gas tank was almost empty, and my phone, lying dead on the passenger seat, gave no clues. The last thing I remembered clearly was standing in the bedroom, facing the thing that called itself a man. A part of me wanted to believe I had dreamed the whole experience, but the deep, crescent-shaped scratches on my arms told a different story. I needed to get to a town, somewhere with people, somewhere safe. I drove for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. The dense mountain forest eventually gave way to sparse trees and open fields, but the road remained eerily empty. No other cars passed me. No signs announced nearby towns. When I finally saw a gas station on the horizon, relief swept over me. It was an old, weathered structure with a single pump and a small convenience store attached. Not exactly bustling, but it was something. As I pulled in, I noticed an older man behind the counter inside the store. He watched me intently through the window, his gaze sharp and unsettling. I stepped out of the car, every muscle in my body taut with tension. "Afternoon," he said when I entered. His voice was gravelly, and his eyes darted nervously toward the door behind me. "Hi," I managed, my voice dry and weak. I need gas. And do you know where the nearest town is?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked me over carefully, as if assessing whether I was real. "You come from the north?" he asked finally, his tone guarded. Yeah," I said, unsure how to explain what had happened. "I was staying in a cabin up that way, but—" "You're lucky you got out," he interrupted, his voice low and serious. "What do you mean?" The man leaned closer, his expression dark. "People go missing up there. All the time. They don't come back." My stomach twisted. "I saw someone. A man." He wasn't a man," the old man cut in sharply. "Not anymore." I wanted to press him for more information, but something in his tone told me it was better not to. I filled up my tank, bought a bottle of water, and got back on the road as quickly as I could. But the old man's words stuck with me. Not a man. What did he mean? I reached a small town by nightfall. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other, and my disheveled appearance drew a few stares as I checked into a cheap motel. That night, I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Those empty sockets. That jagged smile. When I finally drifted off, the dreams came. I was back in the cabin. The man, or whatever he was, stood in the corner of the room, his presence heavy and suffocating. "You let me in," he whispered, his voice echoing in my skull. I protested. "I didn't open the door." He smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. "You didn't have to." I woke up drenched in sweat, the echo of his voice still ringing in my ears. The next morning, I decided to go back to the cabin. It was insane, I knew that, but I needed answers. I couldn't move on until I understood what had happened. I told myself it would be quick. I'd drive back, take a look around, and leave before nightfall. As I drove, the familiar unease returned, growing stronger with every mile. The forest seemed darker than before, the air heavier. When I finally reached the gravel road, I found it exactly as I'd left it, blocked by the same fallen tree. I parked the car and continued on foot, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The cabin was still there, but it looked different. The wood was darker, warped and rotting, as if decades of decay had taken hold in the span of a few days. The windows were shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood. I moved cautiously through the rooms, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for the bedroom. The bed was gone, replaced by a circle of charred earth. Symbols were etched into the walls, dark and jagged, as if carved by clawed hands. And in the center of the circle, something glinted in the light. A mirror. I approached it hesitantly, my reflection distorted and warped in the cracked glass. As I stared, the room around me seemed to shift. The walls faded into darkness, and the air grew colder. My reflection didn't move. It smiled. "You brought me back," it said, its voice soft and menacing. I stumbled back, but my body didn't move. I could see myself in the mirror, still standing there, still smiling. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I am you," it said, "and you are mine." The mirror shattered, and I was thrown backward, the force of the explosion knocking the air from my lungs. When I opened my eyes, I was outside, lying in the dirt. The cabin was gone. I looked around, disoriented and terrified. The forest was silent, the air still. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I saw it. In the distance, standing between the trees, was the man. Or maybe it was me. I couldn't tell anymore. I don't know how I made it back to my car. The drive down the mountain was a blur, my mind racing with fragmented memories and unanswerable questions. When I finally reached the town again, I went straight to the gas station. The old man wasn't there, but a younger woman stood behind the counter. "I need to talk to him," I said, my voice frantic. "The man who works here. Please." She looked at me, confused. "There hasn't been anyone working here for years," she said. "I left that town and never looked back. But no matter how far I go, I can't escape it. I see him, or myself, in the reflections of windows and mirrors. I hear his voice in my dreams, whispering the same words over and over. You let me in. And now, as I write this, I can feel him behind me, his breath cold on my neck. I don't dare turn around, because I know what I'll see. And I know it's only a matter of time before he takes me back to the cabin, back to where I belong.